Studio audience is this size. We simply point to you and you say your name and where you're from, and then we know who we are and where we're coming from. So I'll start over here.
Steve Holder, CGU and CPS.
Welcome, Steve.
Terry Curley, and I'm a visitor at Pilgrim Place.
Welcome.
I'm Lynn Juarez, a resident at Pilgrim Place.
Welcome.
Sherine Sherhart, Pilgrim Place.
Good to see you. We're saying our names and where we're from. You're on this side.
Yeah, okay. I'm Jim Potter. I am a PhD student here.
Welcome, Jay.
Andrew Schwartz, Center for Process Studies.
And our IT guru. Yes, sir.
Arajo Reza from Chicago.
Welcome from Chicago.
Iris from the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Dongmu Lee from Center for Process Studies.
And South Korea.
Chase Kirkham from CGU and CPS.
Welcome, Chase.
Leah Laird from CPS.
Welcome.
Bill Trimble from across Indian Hill.
Good to see you.
Audrey Sorrento from Pilgrim Place.
Welcome. Lisa.
Ronan Howell from New Road School in Santa Monica.
Welcome.
John Cobb, Pilgrim Place.
The father of us all.
Philip McKeon, also from Pilgrim Place.
Welcome. And welcome to our online audience, I should have said. Professor Olav Smith teaches philosophy and religious studies at Cal State Chico. He says that's Northern California.
Very northern, yes.
His doctorate is from here, Claremont Graduate University, in philosophy of religion and theology. Dr. Smith is author of Myths of the Self, Narrative Identity, and Postmodern Metaphysics. In the mid-90s, when he worked here at the Center for Process Studies, Dr. Smith edited our Process Perspectives magazine. Later, he and his wife Tara co-edited Empirical magazine, which had a spectacular career. It was dedicated to the advancement of process and radical empirical philosophies, as well as aesthetics and progressive politics. It won Library Journal's 10 Best New Magazines award in 2012. Today, the title of Dr. Smith's presentation is Toward an Ecological Ethic of the Beloved Community. Will you please welcome Dr. Olav Smith.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank John Cobb for giving me this opportunity to be here today. And I've called this presentation Toward an Ecological Ethic of the Beloved Community because it's a new project for me. This paper that I am writing is a result of last summer's amazing conference here. My hope is to give the gist of what the paper is about, to solicit feedback, and hopefully to stimulate a few thoughts at the same time. I'm going to put a few principles up here as we go along, and the first one is new to me. It may not be to you, but no ethic short of an ecological ethic has ever been adequate. And that for me is a big statement, brought up in traditional philosophical ethics that's so anthropomorphic. As a society, we are just now waking up to that reality. Our slumbers regarding the necessity of an ecological ethic is the source of many of our most urgent problems today. Most of you know who this fellow is, Alfred North Whitehead. But in brief, he's the creator of a metaphysical system that's now called process philosophy. The centerpieces of his work are the trilogy Science in the Modern World, Process and Reality, and Adventures of Ideas. He called this new way of thinking of the world philosophy of organism. I wrote about his metaphysics in my first book, Myths of the Self, Narrative Identity, and Postmodern Metaphysics. Organic philosophy, one of my principles. A truly ecological ethic must be situated in the framework of an organic philosophy, which is to say a philosophy that provides a framework for a holistic ecology where all beings are interactive within a single system. Organic metaphysics is an alternative to a mechanistic ontology as well as classical substance ontologies. The first full definition in Merriam-Webster of an organism is a complex structure of interdependent and subordinate elements whose relations and properties are largely determined by their function in the whole. This photograph that you've been seeing is Pando populus. Despite appearances, it's one organism, say one plant, that's become a symbol of Whitehead's philosophy of organism, thanks to Eugene Shirley's new website and organization. Whitehead wrote in Modes of Thought, "The doctrine that I am maintaining is that neither nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe." One of the things that one must be careful not to lose in an organic philosophy is the importance of the individual. A truly ecological ethic must acknowledge the intrinsic value and freedom of individuals that comprise the ecosystem. In Myths of the Self, I built on Whitehead's organic framework to suggest that individuals are storying beings, telling a story. We inherit a past, sift through that inheritance, interpret it, and express our reaction to it while considering alternative possibilities. Our narrative identity is intrinsically valuable, as is every occasion of experience that has led up to it. There is no narrative storying process without freedom, and freedom is the basis of moral agency. With freedom comes responsibility. Storying is a creative process, and it comes with moral obligations. One of the problems with the modern worldview has been its theoretical isolation of the individual. I have in mind Cartesian dualism and its aftermath. One of the results has been a theoretical solipsism, with an isolated mind or brain in here and the suspect world out there. So I say, a truly ecological ethic includes a community of individuals who cooperate in a network of concern for each other. Within this organic worldview, we no longer have to use the language of self and other. We are neighbors in community and not an objective ego in here and another out there. A truly ecological ethic unites the one and the many in one organic whole without losing the identity of individual persons in the process. Whitehead wrote that the many become one and are increased by one. In a philosophy of organism, the ultimate value of the whole is intimately connected with the achieved values of the many. Every individual is important. The whole is important. We achieve value and importance together. Moreover, there's a dialectical process of the one and the many. The ultimate value of the whole influences the becoming of the many, and the achieved value of the many influences the ultimate value of the whole. An organic discussion of the universe clearly involves more than the individual and the whole, though. I've chosen this photograph because it suggests many habitats within or with nested communities within this small space. In this regard, I say, a truly ecological ethic is communitarian in nature, recognizing the ecosystem as communities nested within other communities. Each community is valued for the role that it plays in the ecosystem. Whitehead speaks of this in terms of societies, and he puts great emphasis on the cooperative aspect of evolution. Our own bodies are made up of such nested communities. The brain, the heart, the liver, and so on are all communities of cells that cooperatively function for their personal good and for the common good of the body. The key to Whitehead's organic philosophy, his solutions to the mind-body problem, is what David Griffin termed PanExperientialism, This is Whitehead's theory that every existing being, or what he calls actual entities, have some degree, even if minimal in some cases, of experience. A truly ecological ethic, then, is panexperiential and values the experience of every actual entity in nature. Descartes, who was certain that the world is a machine, thought that this dog is a machine too, and that we just imagine that it has feelings and experience. An ecological ethic teaches us to be aware of the experiencing entities and systems around us, learning to work together with those entities and systems rather than against them. We're all in this together. A few hundred years ago, talking bird was even more of a remarkable phenomenon to most people in the world than it is today. I'm using this to symbolize the expressiveness throughout all of nature. A truly ecological ethic is panexpressive and values the expressiveness of every actual entity in nature. I introduced this term PanExpressionism in Myths of the Self because I believe that the term PanExperientialism leads us, or at least some of us, to focus too much on the receptive aspect of experience rather than the expressive aspect of experience that Whitehead refers to as transition. An ecological ethic teaches us to be more mindful of our own expressions and more lovingly aware of the expressions of our neighbors in the community around us. So in considering expressiveness, we get into what Whitehead terms creativity or eros and the creation of beauty in our lives. A truly ecological ethic values the creative potential of all actual entities and the beauty that is created in nature. It suggests that life is an evolving art form. We are free to create. Create what? A painting, a poem, a new computer program, a spreadsheet, or a meal. We're always creating. Whitehead believed that fundamentally what is created is aesthetic value, what is primarily felt and only secondarily thought about. So he used the traditional term for the ideal of aesthetic value, beauty, and the good is maximizing this beauty. For Whitehead, eros is the love of beauty, the beautiful creation, experience, or encounter. The artist's life is one of living in the love of this type. I can't emphasize this enough, that at the heart of organic philosophy is love. In this case, it is passionate love on a quest for beautiful experience. Whitehead's analysis of beauty leads him to talk about harmony and intensity of experience. A truly ecological ethic aims for the maximization of harmony and intensity of experience. Like Aristotle, however, Whitehead suggests that we can have too little or too much of these. We are aiming to get it just right. Aristotle, of course, associated this goal with virtue and called this sweet spot of getting it just right the golden mean. Whitehead's theory is significantly more complex than this, and I'm considering calling it the platinum mean as a result. This is Charles Hartshorne's aesthetic circle, which gets at the more complex idea of getting it just right. And I've taken this from Brian Henning's book, The Ethics of Creativity, where it is explained in some detail. It involves two axes instead of one. We can have too little harmony or too much. Too much harmony might seem unlikely, but consider a musical performance with one instrument and one note. The intensity of the beauty of the performance would be very limited. That's why harmony is connected with what Whitehead called massiveness of experience, which can also be too much or too little. Massiveness is made up of variety of effective contrast. Great musical compositions, paintings, and dance performances, for example, express a variety of effective contrast. Importantly, so do richly diverse societies. The rejection of diversity is a rejection of the possibilities of incredibly rich experience. So the good life is the beautiful life. But for whom? Just for me? Not in an organic philosophy. A truly ecological ethic begins with and expands through love. It begins with eros and blossoms into the love of the common good, which is agape. Moral maturity, as I like to call it, depends on a growing awareness that my good is connected with your good. Our good is connected to our neighbor's good. We are in community together. Nowhere is this seen more clearly than in the health sector, where if we do not find ways of safely treating communicable diseases, we are all endangered. Our good is also connected ultimately with the environment and our socially expressive dialogue with the environment. We are in community with the environment. This is Josiah Royce. But before I talk to you about Josiah Royce, I've just given you the framework for what I'm doing in this paper. I'm a constructive postmodern thinker with Whiteheadian roots. But in this paper, I'm also attempting to show how increasingly Royce is helping me to grow as a constructive postmodern philosopher. As a brief introduction, Josiah Royce is a native Californian from Grass Valley, near where I live in Northern California, who went on to serve as the chair of the philosophy department at Harvard University during its golden age. He was a friend and dialogue partner of William James and Charles Peirce. His major works are The Religious Aspect of Philosophy, The World and the Individual, which has 2 dates there because it was Gifford lectures that were in 2 parts. Process and Reality was Gifford lectures. Philosophy of Loyalty, and The Problem of Christianity. Organic philosophy. Personally, I was quite surprised to see how much of an organic philosopher Royce was. Royce does not, contrary to popular belief, honor the Royce does, contrary to popular belief, honor the individual and individuals in community. And he even has some things to say about nested communities. Within the organic whole, for instance, he writes, our whole theory presupposes that individuals may be included within other individuals, that one life, despite its unique ethical significance, may form part of a larger life, and that the ties which bind various finite individuals together are but hints of the unity of all individuals in the absolute individual. Royce said that to be is to be uniquely related to the whole. Then he writes, in nature, as in man, we find individuality linked in the closest fashion with intercommunication, with the mutual interdependence of individuals, and with a genuine identity of meaning and of being in various individuals. Royce was in dialogue with Charles Sanders Peirce, and I have come to see Royce as an ally of Peirce in what Peirce, but not Royce, called objective idealism. There is a kinship here with process PanExperientialism. Peirce suggested that objective idealism involves the belief that there is some mentality in all of reality. Royce writes that we have no right whatever to speak of really unconscious nature, but only of uncommunicative nature, or of nature whose mental processes go on at such different time rates from ours that we cannot adjust ourselves to the live appreciation of their inward fluency or process, although their consciousness does make us aware of their presence. I'm not here to defend this view entirely, but I am intrigued by it. By many indigenous views, including Native American, it's common sense that great-great-great-grandfather Pando here, who's now over 80,000 years old, is a being with a great deal of experience, and that we can at least mystically feel, appreciate, and perhaps learn from that experience. Food for thought. Again, Royce writes, "It would not be true that nature sometimes, in an exceptional way, pursues ideal goals. On the contrary, every natural process, if rightly viewed from within, would be the pursuit of an ideal. There would be no dead nature at all, only life, striving, on-flow, ideality, significance, rationality." I've shared these quotes from Royce mainly to indicate why I see Royce as an ally in the cause. And speaking of causes, we come to Royce's ethics, where the idea of cause plays a very important role. In his psychology, Royce explains that we learn language skills and other behaviors through imitation. We are, in fact, social before we create our own unique individuality. I've come to appreciate how effectively Royce reverses the modern tendency in ethical philosophy to begin with the individual and then fret about the question of the other in the world out there. For Royce, we begin in a world where our language and behavior is learned by imitating mom, dad, other relatives, neighbors, friends, and importantly, heroes. For Royce, imitation is never pure, and we try on unique expressions of what we are otherwise imitating. Royce also emphasizes the play, especially of the child, and writes that just, meaning precisely, so precisely because the play activities are carried out at a time when they are not necessary to the preservation of the organism, in other words, our survival is not at stake, they receive a free and manifold development. This is where we begin to see in Royce's work freedom in the modification of inherited or imitated aims. This is how we start learning who we are, developing a sense of self within the context of the world into which we're born. Putting this in an ecological context, this play often involves an imitation of nature as well. I think, for example, of hearing Oren Lyons, an Onondagan faith keeper, talk of our imitation of animals and the discovery of medicines long ago. Our ancestors followed the animals, he said, to see what they do when they're sick. A part of many children's play is imitation of animals, and this too assists in our discovery of self. And when I see this picture seen on the screen now, it makes me wonder, like if the Wright Brothers, had a fascination with birds in their flight, and it might have been part of the impetus to their wanting to imitate that in the best way that we can. But it can be an imitation of any aspect of nature, a tree, or the nature of water in meditation, for instance, that helps us better realize who we are as individual human beings. Art is a kind of imitation too. All creativity begins with imitation, and through our artistic imitation of nature, or even in our appreciation of these works, our spirits soar into an imaginative expansion, or what Royce called an ideal extension of our personal identity. So where does moral philosophy begin? It begins, according to Royce, with the moral conflicts that arise as we're engaging in our imitative behavior. I have a picture of Gandhi here because I was thinking of how sympathy and compassion begins with imitative actions and feelings, and how this idea plays out in Gandhi's life. He's a perfect exemplar in some ways. Gandhi had learned through imitation, because education is an imitative activity, how to be an English attorney. He had learned how to be a good Hindu through imitative feelings, feeling what it's like to be in his neighbor's shoes, or sandals as the case may be. He had compassion for Hindus under English rule. He felt compassion for Muslims who were in fear of living under Hindu rule. He even felt sympathy for the English oppressors and went out of his way to make sure that he wasn't being unfair to them. He was influenced by Jesus and Tolstoy and learned to imitate their ways. He read the Bhagavad Gita and learned through internal imitation of the story that doing the right thing was always more important than any consideration of death. He took this very seriously. One can imagine Gandhi or anyone in this kind of position becoming skeptical of there being a moral solution. Royce wrote in the religious aspect of philosophy that skepticism arises not from hopelessness as much as a perpetual hesitation in the choice of ideals. The skeptic asks, coming to a fork in the road like this one, which way do I go? What aim should I follow? Royce argued that the genuine skeptic actually is stuck because he wants, like Gandhi no doubt did, to be fair to everyone. Royce writes that absolute skepticism would thus be founded on absolute benevolence. Its own aim would be harmony and unity of conduct. In practical situations, Royce helps me to see that the only way to transcend moral conflict of the sort that brings many to skepticism is to discover a higher ideal that transcends the conflict and brings harmony to relationships. Royce called harmony the ideal of ideals. And I'm reminded of the Confucian ideal of Ren. Ren can be translated in many ways, but I find most, such as benevolence, to be misleading. Chinese characters are works of art. They have to be interpreted as such in many cases. This is a stick figure person, and the curved lines suggest multiple people learning to take the path of life together, harmoniously. So, taking my lead initially from some comments from Houston Smith, that's what I tell my students. It's learning how to live in harmony together. Perfect harmony may be a remote ideal, but Royce believed that we should always make the effort anyway. I am reminded of Gandhi's maxim, be the change that you want to see in the world. This kind of higher synthesis is what Gandhi was seeking when he went to the side of his Muslim neighbors, when they were being attacked by his fellow Hindus. He sought, as Royce did, harmony through a higher synthesis that would allow each side to follow their beliefs without harming one another. This type of painting in China represents Lao Tzu, Confucius, and the Buddha, or three representatives of their faiths, getting along wonderfully after a walk and chat together. This has become a symbol in China for how the three faiths have found harmony through a higher synthesis throughout much of Chinese history. In speaking of higher synthesis, Royce believed that we were called to a unification of aims. Due to his teachings, Royce's work had a direct bearing on at least two people involved in the formation of the League of Nations, which later led to the United Nations, including Woodrow Wilson, which came about in order to provide just such a higher transcendent ideal seeking harmony in the midst of conflict. One of the things that prevents us from attaining this harmony of higher synthesis, despite our initial socially situated self, is what Royce called the illusion of selfishness. After a sense of self begins to emerge, we suffer from this illusion because we can control our own actions to some degree and can't control the actions of our neighbors, then objectified as the other. For this reason, Royce believed that we tend to think of our own experience as more real than the others. The only way out of this illusion is the experience of what Royce called moral insight. Moral insight is linked to interaction and reflection. Gandhi got out in the world and learned about other people from all walks of life. This was the basis of his compassion. Two people who once were estranged from one another can learn to be in genuine relationship with one another only through interaction and reflection that gives way to the moral insight that we are fellow travelers through life who ought to respect and love one another, at least in the agapic sense. Royce believed that education plays a big role in helping us and others to have such moral insight. The same thing is true of our relationship with nature, of course. Just getting out into nature can lead to moral insight and respect for other forms of life than our own. This is a photo that I recently took of one of my favorite spots in Paradise, where I live. Here we have another fork in the road. I mentioned at the beginning that causes are very important for Royce. In his book, Philosophy of Loyalty, in terms related to Royce's conception of a social self, Royce argued that we cannot find our authentic selves in isolation. We only begin to find our places and establish our identities in the world in communal networks. We find ourselves in the causes we choose to serve. We find ourselves when we freely choose a life plan or purpose. When someone is lost in life, Royce recommends that we choose something. Almost anything will do. Be somebody, he tells us. Choose a goal. Go for it. Let this be your cause. Our chosen cause is what ultimately determines our moral code. Like Whitehead, Royce did not believe there is such a thing as a detailed moral code that would apply at all times to all places. But having found a goal, Royce encourages us to devote ourselves to the task completely. This devotion he calls loyalty. In his discussions of the Apostle Paul, it becomes clear that by loyalty, Royce means something very akin to agape. It is a loving devotion to the universal or beloved community. In loyalty, one surrenders the personal will or ego for the sake of something higher than self. Royce developed the concept of loyalty to loyalty as a test of causes. Some causes are good and some are bad. Some causes are creative in the sense of allowing more and more people to work out their individual loyalties to causes together. Other causes are destructive of this higher ideal of the beloved community, uniting in a diversity of loyalties to various causes. Sometimes this means taking a stand against destructive loyalties, as Royce did in World War I, when he interpreted Germany's motives as aggressive and destructive of the overall good of humanity. Ecologically, for me, this means, amongst other things, interpreting political and economic decisions in light of a loyalty to loyalty. Are our decisions constructive of an organization of life where more beings can live lives of loving devotion to their own causes? Or are our decisions destructive of such an organization of life? One of the things that Josiah Royce talks about in The World and the Individual is the need for leadership. Royce writes that the triumph over treason, and that's to the beloved community, can only be accomplished by the community or on behalf of the community through some steadfastly loyal servant who acts, so to speak, as the incarnation of the very spirit of the community itself. In my essay, Dr. King is an example of such an avatar, to borrow Gary Herstein's term for this leadership role. Herstein's essay, The Roycean Roots of the Beloved Community, which partly builds on work done by Rufus Burrow Jr., is the best work that I'm aware of connecting King with Royce. The concept of the beloved community plays a central role in King's work. In order to keep my presentation to an appropriate length, I'm going to have to be very brief with this section of the essay. I'm referencing the work of Rufus Burrow Jr. and Gary Herstein to show the direct and indirect ties to Royce's thought through his teachers at Boston University, in particular the Boston personalists DeWolf and Brightman, and Howard Thurman, who was familiar with Royce. Organic philosophy. There is an element of organic philosophy in Dr. King's work, as when he writes, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one destiny affects all indirectly. In my paper, I'm referencing King's sermon, The Three Dimensions of a Christian Life. King encourages us to pursue the length of life by loving ourselves. He encourages us to pursue the breadth of life by loving our neighbors. And the height of life represents our loving relationship with God. King writes that human worth lies in relatedness to God. I relate this to Royce saying that to be is to be uniquely related to the whole. I will also be discussing an essay called, and written by Dr. King, The Ethical Demands of Integration, which goes along with several of my points about an organic philosophy and an ecological ethic. The first of the three demands is the intrinsic value of persons. He wrote, "There must be recognition of the sacredness of human personality." He connected this with the biblical idea of the image of God. Throughout his work, King explicitly ties this to the words of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. In this essay, King also paraphrases Kant, saying all men must be treated as ends and never as mere means. With moral insight, it is a small jump from there to saying that all sentient beings must be treated as ends and never as mere means. The second ethical demand is freedom. King writes, life demands freedom, and that a denial of freedom to an individual is the denial of self. In a broader ecological context, think of animals in small cages in factory farms. In a broader, King quotes Tolstoy approvingly, "I cannot conceive of a man not being free unless he is dead." King's third ethical demand is, and I quote, "a recognition of the solidarity of the human family." King writes, "The universe is so structured that things do not quite work out rightly if men are not diligent in their concern for others. The self cannot be self without other selves." The latter part of this quote is clearly related to Royce's social ontology and his continuing insistence that we find our selfhood in a social setting. And I find that the first part of the quote is easily relatable to an ecological context where we take others to be our neighbors in the broadest sense of the term. Nonviolence in the beloved community. The path to the place of peace was nonviolent, and it leads to the ultimate solidarity that is the beloved community. King writes, "I must continue by faith or it is too great a burden to bear." And violence, even in self-defense, creates more problems than it solves. Only refusal to hate or kill can put an end to the chain of violence in the world and lead us toward a community where men can live together without fear. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. Finally, King found hope that we would get there someday in his faith in the moral universe. We can all take hope with King when he wrote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And again, in The Stride Toward Freedom, King wrote that the universe is on the side of justice. Consequently, the believer in nonviolence has deep faith in the future. This faith is another reason why the nonviolent resistor can accept suffering without retaliation. So in summary, the paper that I'm working on is an ecological ethic rooted in Whitehead's organic framework. I've suggested that Royce is an ally in the cause. Before I go on, I want to just point out that this picture is an artist's version of an eco-city that's been planned to be built in China, in Tianjin. So an ecological ethics must include an organic framework that acknowledges the importance of individuals in community, avoiding the illusion of selfishness, through moral insight that leads to recognition of nested communities within an organic whole, honoring the experience and the expression and the creativity of all beings. As humans, we participate in a universe that seeks a maximum of harmony and intensity, which often comes through a higher synthesis of potentially conflicting aims. I have expressed the view that the universe begins with eros and in seeking harmony blossoms into agape, and that we need leadership that will take us on a peaceful path to the beloved community where there is solidarity with one another and ultimately solidarity with the environment.
Thank you, Olav. We have at least 45 minutes to discuss elements of the work in progress. Who has the first comment or question?
I have a comment. I just want to thank you very much for the beautiful images which really bring the text to life.
Thank you. I put a lot of work into that. It's some of the same talent I brought to the magazine. You know, if you ever got to see the magazine, I did the graphic design for that. And I take pleasure in that, to try to make the images speak to the message. So thanks for commenting on that. And I was mentioning to those who were setting up, helping me set up this morning, that it's really important. I want to make sure I get the PowerPoints.
I was intrigued, as we all were, by parts of, but I just want to focus for a moment on the feature of nested communities, because I thought that was a lovely image of indeed a way in which we all are together at the beginning in a nest in some way, and then perhaps fly the nest. If you think of the bird image as the one that comes up in that sense.
That's nice.
But also the sense of nesting as, let's say, the Russian dolls are nested.
Exactly. I use that a lot. Well, Whitehead used that a lot, so I borrow that.
So would you comment on how that might be part of the ecological city image at the end, in which what things would be nested and how would they be sometimes in communities that you might not think about? You see what I'm getting at? That sense of a nest you were mentioning about the internal organs, in which we have a nest of biochemical activities in our bodies, and then we are nested in a human community, of course, or we wouldn't be who we are, learning symbol systems and so on, and then nested in a larger eco-community around us, which we're often, as we've said earlier, quite unconscious of in our own cultural systems. But there they are, and there are many, many more which perhaps then would be linked to the creation of this eco-civilization cities. You want to speak about that a bit?
Briefly, anyway, and then I'm hoping that it won't be just me involved in the discussion of such important questions. I would imagine that John might have something to say about this too, because he's doing such important work, at least inspiring some in China to do some of this ecological work. And I mentioned in my presentation the nesting that goes on within our own body. So to mention a city to begin with, you have to look at the microscopic and the macroscopic, and so even a cell that has a nucleus is a nested community. So it goes way down, and then electrons forming a stone or something is a nested community. So it goes all the way down. There are so many things that we do in ignorance of that fact that have polluted the environment that we can turn to something like Tianjin and say, okay, this is an effort to recognize that nestedness, to realize that what I do as a member of this ecological community is going to affect the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the farming activities that John has expressed such concern with, and that was just talking to him briefly beforehand about Wes Jackson and his work. That is part of this idea too, that learning how to work with nature, work with the communities of nature that we're nested with, instead of just acting against them, assuming that we are, as some people have interpreted the Bible, you know, of being the lords of the land and what we say goes, kind of thing, dictators of the process. So that we end up in the kind of problem that Bill McKibben, for instance, talked about as the end of nature, where human beings are dictating the processes now. So this Tianjin represents to me the effort to back away from that as quickly as we can to a place where we're in community with nature, rather than making it so there is no more nature because we've taken over and we are bending it to our wills. But before another question, I'd love to hear other comments about that from others of you, if we can, because we have time. John?
The issue that I have worried about the most, although it applies all the way up and down, is because I think human communities are extremely important, and that we cannot have, and I love the beloved community imagery, but of course the immediate reaction of many skeptics is that's tribalism. And I really, since I've read so little of Royce, I'm curious, does he discuss that problem in some detail? How we can really accent belonging to multiple communities and still avoid the we-they relationship between these communities. I sense that that is what is involved, and certainly Martin Luther King was and Gandhi were both very sensitive to this danger and spent a lot of time working against it, but Gandhi felt he failed in the end. It's just such a huge problem that.
Right, and I'm going to come back to your question in a moment. Then that's what I take the work of the loyalty to loyalty to be doing as a test of causes. And, you know, Royce says that we can begin to, you know, I talk in terms of moral maturation. That's not his term, but I picture it as a moral maturation that goes on, that he says begins with loyalty to anything. When we devote ourselves to any kind of community, he even uses the example of what we might consider to be a bad cause, you know, well, with good reason. He uses the example of pirates. But we could think in terms of violent gangs and so on today, that even within a violent gang, we could say that people are learning certain virtues within the community that they're operating in as a community. The loyalty to loyalty comes in when we're stepping on other people's toes, so that the beloved community really is the kingdom of heaven image put in more secular terms, where everyone is serving causes, their own causes, without impinging on the loyalties of others, if that makes sense. And it's an ideal goal. He knew that, and certainly with we can try as hard as we can with King and Gandhi and so on, and there's no perfect roadmap to getting there. I think that's why I think with Gandhi saying, be the change that you want to see in the world, don't wait for the other person to make it all right before you act. You know, I see that same thing in Royce, that anything short of trying to create the beloved community here on earth is treason. He uses that word. He calls it a betrayal of loyalty. And ultimately, it may seem, because of the illusion of selfishness, like we are serving our own loyalty when we're betraying loyalty as a whole. But once we have moral insight into this togetherness with others, and he admits, he says, not everybody has a moral insight. Could very well be that they're stuck in the illusion of selfishness. But once we have a moral insight and we can recognize these fellow travelers on the way and their causes, it relates to the Kantian idea of treating people as ends, in a sense, then we're doing what we should do, even if it doesn't ultimately work out. We're serving the ideal. And that's Royce's idealism to me, is that we serve the ideal even if it's never attained. But the beloved community is a real thing for him, though, too. It's like Jesus saying that the kingdom of heaven is within. The beloved community is a reality that we can either serve to actualize through our actions, or we can be destructive of through our actions. You had a question before?
The question really
relates
to both of the prior questions. One of Royce's contemporaries was John Wesley Powell.
Okay.
Who, after floating down the Colorado River, said that water in the West must be about watersheds, and the governance of the land must be the governance of people who shared the watershed, though with different needs. We now in Southern California like to consider ourselves part of the Colorado River watershed, despite the fact that it's only concrete and steel that connect us to that watershed. What this raises for me is the place of the local in both the community and in the environment, and to what extent, whether in Grass Valley or slightly down the range with Mary Snyder, or in the Rocky Mountain watershed, we are in fact at odds with our neighbors, but in some ways even more with our non-neighbors. And what is the beloved community in fact a community of neighbors who are capable of dealing with each other's issues, or a community that extends beyond the neighbor?
Well, I'm considering the other, whatever the other is, to be a neighbor. So that's universal. That's cosmic, ultimately. So, but in more earthly terms, like what you've presented there, of course, I do see the beloved community as being an answer to those kinds of things, where we do work in harmony. Now, one of the questions that it raises for me, and I really am a beginner at this, I don't have ecological expertise that I'm bringing to this. I'm learning as I go. So what I've been reminded of is indigenous cultures and what they have to teach us about learning to live simply off the land. And I wonder if there isn't a certain point at which we get so big that we can't help but impinge on our neighbors' causes, our neighbors' loyalties, and so on. And that big fan, going way back, of V.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, of finding that economy of scale. And in some cases, maybe we do just we're too greedy and we overstep appropriate bounds, where we necessitate stepping on one another.
Well, I mean, that's exactly where I want to come into this. I mean, everything you've shown us is beautiful. It's fantastic. And I think in terms of the human condition, and it's the human condition that prevents us from entering this beloved solidarity. And as you revise or as you expand your paper, I wonder if you can think a little more, say a little more about what it is that prevents, I mean, your heroes got assassinated for what they did. I mean, for presenting this and trying to realize this. So what is it that...
One of Royce's answers is very appealing, and it comes straight out of Christianity. I mean, he's very explicit. He deals with Paul and Paul's forming of the beloved community in his time, the early Christian church. And so atonement is a big issue for Royce. And he says it's the community that must atone with those assassins. There are going to be assassins, and that we have to turn around then and bring them back into community. We have to turn again and again and again. So there's no ideal, map to saying, okay, well, we're going to correct everybody's emotions, make them have a moral insight, and then arrive at the beloved community. No, the beloved community is already here. And there are some people who don't have moral insight, and in fact, we all at some point or another fall short of moral insight, and we step on each other. And it's the community that Royce, and maybe I should say more about that in the paper, of the community is the source of the atonement, brings back the betrayers of loyalty, betrayers of the beloved community. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't know if it's legitimate or not, but I was hoping that that the beloved community could include more than humanity, but sentient beings, because I think we have a great insensitivity, and we exploit many, many other beings in this world.
Did I hear you say insentient beings?
No, I said sentient.
Oh, you said sentient, okay. That's exactly what I was trying to...
What I mean are animals and everything and birds and the whole show.
Right.
That we are not very respectful of, supportive of.
Right. And the part that I mentioned in the paper that I really like a lot is Royce's idea that education plays a big role. And I think of, like Bill McKibben makes an effort to say, we need, about the healing powers of nature. I think of John Muir, for instance. John Muir really speaks to this in terms of the religious aspect of our relationship to nature. It's only when you get out in nature and you experience it that I think you really begin to fully appreciate how together we are, and that we're different life forces that are interacting with one another. I was mentioning to Philip here, just as we were starting, that my one trip to Indonesia, one of the biggest things that made an impression on me there was it's teeming with life. And I thought to myself, well, no wonder they're animistic. You can feel the life forces all around you. And then when you come back to the United States, there's something we've done, it seems to me, that in a lot of places is squashed that. And I was thinking maybe we've caused nature in some ways to withdraw from us because of our attitudes. There are places, like I'm going to leave here tomorrow and go up to Big Sur in Monterey is sort of my pilgrimage and recharge there. I love Monterey. It's my first taste of California. And there's something about the Central Coast there, for instance, where I get that feeling. It's more on the mystical ends of things, I know, but it's this feeling that there's something about the forces of nature here that's helping to protect this area. And I almost feel like I'm entering into a bubble when I go into an area like that. And I've had conversations with people about how you can go into an area like Hawaii and be tested by nature, tested by the environment. Do you really belong here? Are you serious here? Are you sincere? Yeah.
I lived in Kauai for 3 years, so that really resonates with me. Made me think of the term biophilia, and maybe expand.
I haven't heard that.
Somewhat used by Edward O. Wilson, who had the Harvard biologist who had some issues with some aspects of his work, but he had some great things to contribute. He wrote a book called Biophilia,
Okay.
and I think it extended to be called Biogeophilia, especially if you expect, and I've experienced this in Native American ceremonies with background in Lakota Sundance ceremonies, and I think this made me think that the positive side of tribalism that John's mentioned, and that this loyalty to something
Right.
is incredibly important. How to get away from the negative side of that, I think, is a big, but we definitely, there's a biogeophilia in the performance of the ceremony, but it's also around community, but that community in Lakota, when you end an oration or a prayer, you say, Mitakuye Yasin. We're all related, all my relations. You'll hear that anytime someone ends a prayer or a speech or something. And so then within the ceremony, there's all these things that are done that bring people together. And then there's even an element of this atonement that you're talking about, which I think is written. I think the United States as a culture, we have to atone for slavery, we have to atone for the genocide of Native people. But then it's just as human beings, we're not perfect, and communities do. I like that piece, and I think that has to do with the harmony through higher synthesis. That to be correct, there be maybe a connection between the atonement and the harmony through higher synthesis.
Sure, because sometimes it seems like our loyalties are at odds, and there are ways of finding a way of bringing together those energies so that they work in a different way than we might have imagined before. I mean, that's one of the things, if I may insert here, I'm not sure if you were finished, but we'll go back to you if not.
Yeah.
But I have a good friend named Michael Coyle, who wrote a piece for us in our magazine, who's done a lot of work on the prison systems, and he wants to abolish the prison system as it's known. And there are some connections to Hopi traditions there, the atonement of the community with the individual. And I know it sounds terribly idealistic, but we have to move at least more in that direction, to where we're not just taking, well, right now it's a large segment of a whole generation that is just being lost, where we're saying, you don't fit in, so.
I think this restorative justice is one area of trying to deal with some of those things.
And so
huge problem.
You mentioned slavery. I mean, it's part of the same issue. You know, it's the atonement of the community, saying that we can bring us to oneness again by opening arms to you, listening, being in dialogue, honoring your expression and your experience, and seeing what higher synthesis does it lead to. I think you're right.
I heard that teacher of mine call it reconciling polarities.
Okay,
in,
good.
Synthesis, which is a real challenge to do, but which I think is a part of spiritual religious practice, or the moral insight that you mentioned, that moral maturation. I think I resonate with those terms.
Yeah, I very highly respect. I teach Eastern religions, and I have one section every semester on primal religions, as Houston Smith had called them, and I remind everybody that the historical religions that we're about to study are no more than 4,000 years old. We have primal religion, and all of our ancestors practiced for at least 40,000 years, if not from the beginning of humanity. So we have a long record that we can turn back to of how to be more in harmony with nature. Oh, there's a question in the back.
First of all, I would like to thank you for, because as a Chinese, I really appreciate that you indicated some resource from the Chinese tradition, and I also mentioned the ecocities in China. But based on my personal experience, China is under the most serious eco crisis than ever, and so that's the reality of China in China. So it sounds like ironic to me. So I would like to ask, how do you understand the difference, the long distance between reality and the ideal picture?
Well, the first thing that I thought of when you said that was this part that I'm only beginning to grasp of the concept of loyalty to loyalty in Royce, which is, for him, you don't really get loyalty to loyalty until there's a betrayal of some kind or another. That it's, and he uses Peter as an example, or maybe that could have been Randall Ogsier used that with me. I'm not sure if Royce used it or not. But that someone who has betrayed or has experienced this betrayal is now put in a position to really appreciate what loyalty to loyalty means and go on to really contribute to the beloved community. So how I see this in this context, for instance, is it's a common sense insight, really, that I think people around the world have recognized that a lot of times we have to suffer in order to learn anything. But what I see there is because of the intense problem, it then wakes people up too. And so I think part of the reason for the growing movement in China for developing a more ecological life is precisely because of the problems. So out of the paradox, and actually that's very Roycean, the idea that out of paradox can come this higher synthesis. Does that make sense to you? Or? So again, his idealism and idealism in general, I wouldn't want to suggest is pie in the sky, oh, everything will just be fine, even if we think about it right. But it's a goal that we must aim for, even if it looks like a lost cause. In fact, that's another Roycean concept where he talks about lost causes. It's the height of loyalty to loyalty when you know it's a lost cause and you still go for it anyway.
That's interesting. So even if we go down, at least you do it pursuing this greater good because we could fall apart as a human civilization. But I think there are some things in the pragmatic philosophy tradition, which with James and Dewey, Royce isn't really considered a pragmatist.
Well, but he is. Well, it depends on who, of course, in all of these is doing the scholarship and who's grouping people together. Like
You're into pragmatic meliorism, not in the sense of that just like things are getting better, but that even as bad as it is, there are ways that we said it's like in China, hey, it's not going to be able to just snap your fingers, but there's a worth in trying to make the attempt, and we can by mustering our faculties make some pieces better. We could this afternoon could be a little better than it would have been if we didn't come together. And I think there's sort of pieces in that pragmatic tradition. I'd be interested how you see Royce connected to that.
I can't really add to that, I think, other than to say that my impression so far, and I feel like I'm a beginning Royce scholar, is that by the end of his career, certainly after dialogue with James and Peirce for many years, he was coming closer. They were closer and closer to each other and learning from each other. So there were some positions that he held strongly, they never quite fully, but that's the same with any philosopher, of course. But of course, James criticized Royce as having a block universe. He didn't recognize that element that Royce was trying to get across of the individual, and it's part of what led to like his work, The World and the Individual. It's re-emphasizing the point that the individual is very important to his philosophy.
I really appreciate your presentation. It was great with the images, and also the moral and ethical principles and values and set based on the Whitehead philosophy. Really appreciate that. But my question lays where your presentation ends. So I want to ask you about how the process ethics or processee ethics answer to the social structural sin or structural evil in a system. So, for example, like the global north and south, and the exploitation of the resource, and it's systemized, and it's real, it's working out there. So, beloved community doesn't work in that picture, in our reality. So, how are you gonna make that these great principles and values working in the realistic picture in our system?
This is a problem that we always go back to as a philosopher, no matter, it seems like whatever we're talking about, oh, that's just philosophy, that's pie in the sky stuff, what about the real world? As a teacher, I find myself all the time having to realize, of course, a lot of us, when we go into philosophy, we want to change the world, we want to make a difference, we want to make the world a better place. And then you realize what an enormous task that is, and you begin to see, hopefully, that all I can do is drop a little pebble in the pond, and then there's a ripple effect. Now, from a theoretical level, we can do that. That's what I'm doing today. It's my little pebble in the pond. Causes some ripples. You then will maybe go out and drop some pebbles in the pond, and it spreads. But in a more practical way, too, that happens all the time. Like in my own community up in Chico. It's a very conservative area. Politically, the idea of electing a Democrat's almost impossible. But around the university, in the downtown area of Chico and so on, you would think you'd have hit liberal bastion. And there are all kinds of experimental ideas going on. And people, in fact, I've encountered a lot of people who are embracing a more anarchistic kind of view of things because they don't see any hope in government solving anything, and feel like if anybody's going to solve the problems, they've got to solve it right there at home. And I think those big problems of the systemic issues are impossible to solve unless we break it down from within. Hate to compare such good things that we're encouraging as to a virus, but in a way it's that same kind of thing. The virus has to spread to defeat the system, so that more and more people like Gandhi are saying, be the change that you want to see in the world. Let's have our own ashram. Let's do things the way they should be done and not worry about it's not worry about what they're doing out there, because of course everything's you can't build your own little shell and escape from the world outside. But I think that's part of what I was addressing too, with this idea of we live in a moral universe, picking up on the King's theme of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that's what gave him the sense that he could press on even in the face of violence when people were hating him and so on. And it's that same kind of hope, that same kind of faith. If you don't have that kind of faith, that the universe itself somehow is encouraging us, calling us, guiding us to do the right thing and be loyal to not only our own loyalties, but to the loyalties of all the sentient beings around us, then of course there's going to be destructive activity, and we have to try to atone for that. No easy answer, in other words, I guess.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. And maybe tell me how you would reconcile this notion of a moral universe and the beloved community across different forms of life with, let's say, certain theories of evolution and competition, survival of the fittest, zero-sum games, and that kind of stuff. Because in one reading of the universe, it looks like it actually requires, not working together, but working against each other for the sake of survival. Does that make sense? Maybe it's out there. It's not working.
No. If you see hesitation, it's because I am not sure what to say beyond the fact that I have really appreciated this element that's shared both by Royce and Whitehead, that you just think of Whitehead's emphasis on cooperation and evolution. Yes, it's true that there seems to be an element of survival for the fittest, but cooperation plays such a big role that we couldn't have formed these nested communities if it wasn't for actual entities and personal societies and so on learning to form structured societies.
I always come from a place of hope. It seems like the darker the skies, the more that energy asserts itself. I see Trump as exposing the shadow of this country, very dark. And I see that as a healthy thing, something people can really look at and respond to. And I also see the possibility that we will come to a place where we'll see that our enemy is not the other, but what we're doing to the environment. And at that time, it might be too late, but at that time, then we'll come together, humanity would come together in support of the earth and of our existence. I know that, I'm not going to apologize for that. That's where I come from.
And it's hard, to ever say that I see a light in where Donald Trump is coming from, I suppose, But it goes back to that matter, I think, of, sometimes we have to suffer before we change. Because, I think it's clear that there are a lot of people, as long as in fact, it's human nature, just human nature, that as long as we're comfortable and we can tolerate the situation that we're in, then we don't change. And so, yes, I can identify with your idea that, okay, well, here the storms are brewing, here there's trouble, but there's a silver lining in the dark cloud, right?
Well, the possibility for change.
Right.
The possibility for metanoia.
Right. And again, there's that, like you indicated, there's that possibility that it's too late. But there's something in me, that, it's the spiritual aspect of things. I'm not going to convince a materialist of this, But that's why I mentioned the Bhagavad Gita, there is that really important point that sometimes it boils down to doing the right thing, whether or not you're going to die or whether anybody else is going to die. It's living in the light rather than in the dark, even in the darkest of times.
I think one way that I know that Thomas Berry and Brian Swim have tried to think about, they argue for a new cosmology. And I think the sense of this, like, how do you do, because ultimately these intense forces of destruction and creation are cosmological forces. If you start reading, how stars, it's actually, if you're thinking about it as a holographic universe, that is a fundamental paradox between creation and not, between creation and destruction, and that somehow grounding ourselves in a larger bit, whether we can solve these problems or not, is possibly finding some equanimity and peace, and then within it, where you start talking, I see that where the kind of Whitehead is a cosmology, metaphysics, and it merges with the cosmology, and that somehow us being away from that, lost a certain touch with some of the deeper creative powers where we can sit with the paradox and somehow strive towards this greater beauty and this higher synthesis. And so, and somehow as a world civilization trying to come to a new cosmology, they argue this, as well as, I don't know if you've ever met a scholar named Drew Dellinger, who works exactly in this king. I'll talk to you more about it afterwards in a dissertation, in part of this area that you're talking about. And, expanding that worldview, we change the world, we need to change our worldview. Tagline. Not an easy thing to do.
Right. One thing you reminded me of there is something that's been become very important to me in teaching both Eastern religions and the adult Sunday school at my church up in Chico, Trinity United Methodist Church. I have realized, well, first of all, I like to compare the Chinese cosmology of ancient Taoism to Genesis. There is the concept of the Tai Chi, which is the supreme ultimate, that arises, this ultimate harmony of harmonies, that arises out of the Wu Chi, which is the chaos. And it's represented on the Tai Chi too, that diagram with the elements and all of that by the black behind the Tai Chi symbol, the yin and yang. And I like to compare that to the idea of the Spirit of the Lord hovering over the deep. The deep has come to represent for me, as I'm sure it has many others before, but the deep, I've realized, is chaos. And we are always in danger of chaos engulfing us. And that's where we find ourselves at when we say the world's falling apart. Chaos is threatening to engulf us. But then I realized after, I'm a little slow, it takes me a while to get this, but I realized after seeing that, having my epiphany about that, began to see, oh, that's what the stories of Jesus walking on the water was about. He was showing us it was possible to live in faith in a way that even though the chaos that's threatening to engulf us at any moment, we can rise above that. Higher synthesis, maybe, there. But in faith, we can walk on water. Walk on the deep, walk on over top of the chaos that is. And I think that's the way it feels sometimes in a spiritual life. Like, yeah, things are maddening and they're breaking down around me, but there's something about realizing the kingdom of heaven within that makes you feel like, it's possible with God's help to walk on water. You might die. But it almost becomes a moot point.
That I think is something about the Bhagavad Gita, which I've always had a challenging time understanding from the story, because I'm not from that culture, but the whole moral is coming from this incredible, bloody, destructive battle.
Mm-hmm.
This is where this moral teaching is coming from.
Right.
I've had a struggle to understand, and yet it gets at that, but it's getting at this, that we are beyond that, and then I also think that this principle of karma yoga in the Bhagavad Gita, that we perform the actions so for the fruit that it bears, because of the intrinsic value of our divinity, and that also to not get hung up on can we achieve the ideal, but is the ideal worth moving into, because it's more beautiful than the alternative, even though that beauty has chaos and violence. It is part of the experience. It's paradoxical, but that's what we have to sit with.
And I didn't expect to actually have these Christian themes emerge out of this, but You know, the whole idea of laying treasures up for heaven rather than here on earth, too, I think ties into that. There's something about evolving our spiritual nature that's terribly important in this, that, again, regardless of the destructive forces around us and where it ends up, life's more than about this short little time that we're on the earth, too, and this short little time that human beings are on the earth.
It's part of the journey of the universe.
Right.
Anyone want the last question? Comment? Well, Olav, I think some of us have pushed you to where we wanted you to go. You gave us the higher synthesis, and I think we want the linkage from where we are to that synthesis. I mean, we're in the creative paradox now, destructive paradox, but we want to, if you want to develop your paper, show the linkage from where we are to the higher synthesis.
Thank you, John.
So shall we thank Olav?
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming here today.
Thank you for coming.